Hi everyone, it's my great pleasure to present a paper. This is a paper with my students. So in this paper, we look into how the use of group identity language could affect public engagement with GMO misinformation and debunking on a popular Q&A platform in China. And we conceptualize our findings as science factionalism, a pattern of how public in a one-party system use faction-based identity language to discuss and debunk science misinformation. So before I dive into this paper, a bit background of me. So I did my master's degree in public policy from Columbia University and my PhD in communication from Stanford. So during my graduate school, my work centered around studying global and political communication, especially looking into how local governments across the world use digital platform as well as offline, deliberative practices to engage and respond to publics in policy making. So during those years, I also participated in the civic engagement innovations in New Haven, like in Shanghai and in Palo Alto, where the government used a variety of offline and online practices to engage citizens. So these works and practical experiences working with the government motivate me to study how public deliberation can be affected by the political forces, deliberation designs, and the social psychology of individuals processing the information. So my current work looking into public deliberation in the context of controversial science issues such as climate change, GMO, and the COVID-19 pandemic, especially looking to public sphere on the digital space. And one critical factor I have studied is the role of group or social identity in influencing how the public engage with science on digital platforms. And this is where the paper I'm going to present today is to look at the relationship between identity, language, and the quality of public deliberation. So here is the motivation of my paper. So we see that a variety of misinformation about science are spreading on the internet these days. From controversial science issues such as whether GMO is safe to eat, to the recent conspiracy narratives about whether the China or the US made the virus in the lab. And a parallel with the spread of misinformation is the rise of identity politics and narratives in both the offline protests and also on social media discussions. So identity is a very multidimensional concept. Some are based on race and ethnicity. Some are based on nationalism, while others center around people categorizing themselves based on their science attitudes, such as the anti-vaxxers and the climate deniers. So the rise of misinformation and identity narratives challenged informed citizenship and public understanding of science. So motivated by this challenge, my paper tackles two goals. So the first is we study how identity language is used in public discussion of science misinformation by asking, is posts about misinformation more likely to use group identity language compared to debunking posts and other non-misinformation related posts? And the second goal is we examine the consequences of using identity language on public engagement with science by looking into how identity language might influence the amount of engagement, such as the number of clicks and comments a post received, as well as the quality of engagement, particularly such as the use of negativity in people's discourse, and also the use of a variety of justification when they try to propagate and debunk misinformation. So in this paper, I draw from the social identity theory, especially classic works that study people's perception toward in-groups and out-groups, and how this group perception could affect people's reasoning based on identity. So there are three key ideas which are highlighted in this social psychology literature about the consequences of identity reasoning on misinformation and public engagement. So first is scholars found that when the message uses this type of identity framing, it can provide fertile ground for misinformation. So for instance, researchers found that the use of group identity language actually prevail in fake news on Twitter, and it can mislead public perception of what is true about the news. And second, this type of identity framing can also fuel more participation, not only in the political activities, and also more engagement of people sharing about these news content. And finally, scholars also show that this type of identity framing can also fuel and foment negativity in public discussion of political campaigns and science issues. So group identity, looking into those literatures, they study about group identity. There are two, approaches scholars have taken to study what is group or social identity. So the first approach is, they will conduct surveys to ask participants, which social groups you categorize yourself into. So this is more about survey approach. And the second approach is, particularly with those scholars who study social media posts, is they will examine the frequency of group identity language, the frequency of mentioning, referring to group identity in the social media discourse. And this is where, particularly on social media, user information are very hard to identify. So this is where the second approach more focused on how the identity language is used on the social media post level. So this is where my paper, the approach is. So in my paper, I study group identity from this second approach because the context of my paper's inquiry is looking at public discussion on the social media platform. And also, the second point is the group identity, again, is a very multidimensional concept. So scholars look into identity based on partisanship, based on country actors such as nationalism. And also people look into identity based on science attitudes. And in my paper, when I look into the GMO discussion in China, the identity which I focus on in this paper is based on people's science attitudes, which I call the pro-GMO faction and the anti-GMO faction. It is the reference to this type of factional language the public use a lot when they discuss the GMO issue. So this is the identity dimension, I particularly look into, for the, GMO discussion. So grounded in this theory and the literature, we propose the below research questions and the hypothesis. So the first research question is, we ask, is misinformation more likely to mention group identity language compared to, debunking messages and other messages? And then the hypothesis 1 and the hypothesis 2 and 3 all look into the consequences of use group identity language. So in hypothesis 1, we propose that misinformation posts that use group identity language will receive more clicks and comments from users. And the second and third hypothesis propose that using group identity language is also associated with use more negativity and less justification in the public discourse. So this is the scope condition. We tested this, research question and a hypothesis. So for the context, we study a very popular, social media platform in China where people share knowledge. It's called Zhihu. So here is a screenshot of the user interface on Zhihu. So people can post questions and answers about a topic on this platform. And then users can also click vote, the vote button, to endorse an answer, and can also comment on the answer. So for the issue focus in this paper, I study, GMO, because GMO is actually one of the most controversial science issues in China that is constantly discussed in the past decade. So, and there are many misinformation about GMO related to its safety, and also conspiracy theories about, the bioweapon foreign influence on Chinese GMO. So for the GMO, discussion, one prevalent identity language the users categorize the users use is to call themselves, I'm the pro-GMO group, you are the anti-GMO group. So this type of factional language is what people often refer to in their public discourse. So what we do is we write programming scripts to scrape all of the posts about the GMO topic from this platform. And we particularly focus on 6,000 answers that are posted by users who frequently discuss the GMO. So we take a deep dive into looking into these 6,000 answers. So here are our mean variables. So for the independent variable in this paper, we perform computational and manual content analysis on these posts. So the first variable is whether a post uses group reference language or not. So whether they use anti-factional language or they use pro-faction language or not. So we developed a dictionary to, we developed a dictionary to capture the reference to this factional language. And we also do human validation check about this group language. And also, about GMO, not every post is in misinformation. So we have a variable to, code whether a post talks about GMO misinformation or not. And then the third variable is if a message talks about GMO misinformation, what is the attitude? What is the individual, the poster's attitude toward GMO? Do they, propagate GMO misinformation or they debunk? Or sometimes the post just shows very vague, ambiguous attitude, doesn't have a clear stance on their attitude. So these are the three major independent variables, we focus on. And then the dependent variable, we're looking to measures two dimensions of public engagement. So one is the amount of engagement. So this is where the number of votes and the number of comments a post received. And the second dimension is the quality of engagement, where we again use both the computational method and the manual coding to analyze the amount of negativity language, such as anger and disgust, used in a post, and also the use of justification, such as whether a post, cite exterior sources or personal stories in a post to justify the opinion. So these are just some of the details I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A. So in order to judge whether a post mentions GMO or not, we use a variety of sources where the two coders will follow these sources to judge whether a post is about GMO misinformation or not. And then here are some of the attitudes, example of attitude we use to see whether the poster propagates misinformation or debunk misinformation or holds a very ambiguous attitude. And then in terms of the use of justification, we particularly look into two types of justification. One is about the use of exterior sources, such as news, science article, and people, any type of news sources. And we don't verify whether the source is true or false, but as long as it cites any exterior sources. And then the second type of justification is also a lot of posts will use personal story narrative to justify their opinion about GMO. So let me share with you some of our very interesting findings. So first, we examine the amount of identity language used in various types of posts. So what we found is, that posts that talk about GMO misinformation, they used a much higher amount of identity language, such as 25%, 23%, compared to posts that do not talk about misinformation, which only use identity language 7% of the time. And interestingly, when we look at the identity language usage for those posts who propagate versus debunk misinformation, we found that actually, debunk misinformation posts also used a substantial amount of identity language compared to posts that propagate misinformation. So in terms of what is the consequence, right, of using identity language on the scale of user participation? So in this table, our dependent variable is public engagement. And you can see that we have two columns, vote, a number of vote are post received, and the number of comments are post received. And then our main independent variable is mention group, and we have all of other control variables. But here is the one showing there is our main variable, whether a post mention group or not. So what we did is we ran the linear regression between our independent variable and the dependent variable for all of the posts, which is the all answer column you see. And then we repeated the same regression model for different subsets of our posts. For instance, for posts that didn't talk about GMO misinformation at all, for posts that propagate misinformation, for posts that debunk misinformation, and for posts that hold ambiguous attitude toward misinformation. So for each type of posts, we look at the relationship of mention group identity language, and the amount of votes and comments they receive. So we found that first, look at the red box here. So first we found that using identity language increased users' votes and comments on a post. So that is true for posts that propagate misinformation and debunk misinformation. So as long as use identity language, people will comment more, and people will also vote more, endorse the post more. And an interesting thing to notice is in this green box are those posts that express ambiguous attitude toward misinformation. So basically they won't say whether I support misinformation or I try to debunk misinformation. Their attitude are very vague. So for those posts whose attitude is very vague, then using identity language doesn't increase user participation. So this means that identity language use can increase participation when the posts states a very clear stance toward the misinformation, either propagate or debunk, rather than holding a very ambiguous or moderate attitude toward that. And finally, we look into the consequence of using identity language on the quality of participation. So here, our independent variable again is mentioned whether a post mention group or not. And the dependent variable is how much negative language in terms of anger or disgust are used in a post. So we found that unexpectedly, for those posts that debunking misinformation, actually, they use more inflammatory language when they use group identity language. And for those posts that propagate misinformation, actually, they use less negative language. So this is where, suggests that when people try to, debunk the GMO misinformation, once they mention about group, they always use, language related to showing anger or showing disgust of the outside group. So we also finally we look into the use of justification. So we found that answers that propagate misinformation, use of group identity language for those posts that use group identity language, they use less justification. And for those posts who debunk misinformation, when they try to call out the other group, they will use more justification to back up their opinion. So let me summarize our paper. So we see that despite of the prevalent use of identity language in misinformation from politics to science issues, little is understood about to what extent debunking messages on social media use identity language, and what are the consequences of identity language on how the public engage with misinformation, not only in the amount of participation, but also in the quality of their participation. So in this paper, we show that both misinformation and debunking posts use a substantial amount of group identity languages. And we term this phenomenon as science factionalism. So discussion about science is motivated around factions that are formed on public attitudes toward the science issues. So in fact, the Chinese, this kind of domain-driven identity language in the form of public attitude divide is crucial for understanding public deliberation and engagement with controversial science issues. So factionalism, actually we see that the Chinese public, they use the term faction to call themselves and each other when they discuss about GMO. And this idea of factionalism can help us understand and explain public discussion of misinformation in countries where multi-party competition lacks. So it's more about attitudinal-based identity language instead of identity which is divided by partisanship. So what are the implications of this science factionalism on the spread and the discussion of misinformation on social media? So first, we see that posts that use this type of factional language, they go more viral. They receive the more digital endorsement, digital votes. This can feed into the attention economy of social media, even among this very science-savvy community in China. So this platform I studied, the people there they are interested in science. They talk about science a lot, but we see that they actually also use a lot of this type of identity language to show anger toward the other groups. So this could reinforce the vicious loop of the identity politics that have already challenged informed citizenship. And we also see that posts that use this type of identity factional language, they were also infused with more inflammatory language. They will use disgusting words or they will show anger. So this negativity could also bring spillover effects, whether to the other lay publics, because other publics, other social media platforms, they might mimic this type of negative behavior and discourse patterns from this platform. And as already there are evidence found that in other social media platforms in China, like Weibo, where the public is less science savvy, when they talk about COVID-19 conspiracy, actually they also use a lot of negativity and a group identity language. So there could also be this kind of spillover effect when the information flow from this science-focused community to the other more lay public community. So these are the things I would like to share, and I very much look forward to hear your comments. Yeah.